crime scene. A cruel irony for a place that was supposed to be a sanctuary. Sam Gillespie sat in the small office he had set up in the vestry, looking through the list of people who had been in the building. Lord Matthew, Ronnie Palliser, Lynn Goodwin, and our own sisters. Sam listed, and Ruth Penny. She was everywhere yesterday. Ruth wouldn't kill a nun for a story, Sam Boniface said, entering with a tray of tea. Wouldn't she? She's ambitious, and this development of the century story is her ticket back to the big leagues. Boniface set the tea down. We need to look at the why before the who. Helena was an archaeologist. She was looking for something, and she found it behind that plaque. They returned to the chapel. The bronze plaque for the late Earl was loose. Boniface used a small screwdriver to pry it away. Behind it was a cavity in the stone, and inside that, a glass jar with a broken wax seal. Empty, Sam noted. But not long ago, Boniface added. The dust hasn't settled in the indentation. The investigation led them to Lord Matthews. They found him in the manor library, surrounded by stacks of unpaid bills and legal notices. My father was a man of faith, Matthews said, his voice cracking as he held a glass of whiskey. But he was also a man of secrets. He told me he'd made provisions for the sisters, but I found nothing, only debt. I'm drowning. Inspector, if this sale doesn't go through, the Sedgwick name ends in a bankruptcy court. Did Sister Helena know about these provisions? She claimed she did. Matthew admitted. She confronted me yesterday. She said my father's heart was in this stone, and that I was betraying his soul. We argued. I was angry, but I didn't kill her. Meanwhile, Ruth Penny was conducting her own investigation. She had dug into the local archives and found a connection that chilled her. Sam, look at this, Ruth said, cornering him in the courtyard. She held up an old-school photograph. Sister Helena didn't just live here. She used to teach at St. Peter's. And look who her star pupil was. Sam looked at the photo. A young, scowling girl stood next to a younger, sterner Sister Helena. It was Lynn Goodwin. Lynn said, Helena made her life a living hell, Ruth whispered. She hated her. She said she'd hated nuns ever since. The pieces were moving, but they didn't yet form a picture. There was the waxy indentation found on the candlestick, a pattern that looked like a signet ring. There was the missing document from the glass jar, and there was the impending contract exchange. Chapter 4. The Final Pageant. The day of the quincentennial arrived with a mock celebratory sun. The town gathered in the convent gardens. The sisters, led by Reverend Mother Adrian, stood in their finest habits, their faces masks of serene courage. The pageant began. Sister Peter declaimed the history of the land, her voice ringing out over the crowd. 500 years, through war and plague, through kings and commoners, the land passed from father to son, the key to each and every one. As the play reached its climax, the symbolic handing of the key, Sister Boniface wasn't watching the stage. She was watching the hands of the guests. She saw the glint of gold on Lord Matthew's hand. She saw the nervous twitch of Lynn Goodwin's fingers. And then, she saw it. In the model of the development Lord Adam Sedgwick Towers, there was a small decorative crest. It matched the indentation in the wax perfectly. The model, Boniface whispered to some. The killer didn't wear a ring. They used the model itself. They gripped the heavy brass corner of the model's base to swing the candlestick. But there was more. The Insocello Inconspicu wasn't about the chapel they were in. The old chapel, Boniface realized, the one in the woods that was deconsecrated a century ago. She slipped away from the crowd, running toward the ruins on the edge of the estate. Inside the crumbling stone walls, hidden behind a loose brick in the altar, she found it, a leather-bound cylinder. Inside was a deed of gift, signed by the late Earl, witnessed and notarized. It bequeathed the entire convent and the surrounding lands not to his son, but to the Catholic diocese in perpetuity. The sale was illegal. The land wasn't Matthew's to sell. She ran back to the gardens just as the speeches were beginning. Lord Matthew was at the podium, his hand trembling as he reached for the pen to sign the final contract with Ronnie Penny. Stop! Boniface's voice cut through the air like a bell. The crowd gasped. Sam and Felix moved forward as Boniface held up the deed. Lord Matthew, she said, her voice filled with a profound sadness. Your father didn't leave you with debt because he was a bad businessman. He left you with debt because he had already given his greatest asset back to God. You knew that, didn't you? You found his letters. You tried to hide the truth. Matthew's face collapsed. The mask of the Earl shattered, leaving only a desperate, broken man. She wouldn't stop, Matthew cried, pointing at the ghost of Helena. She found the jar. She knew the deed existed. If the sale didn't happen, I'd lose everything. The house, the title, everything. You lost your soul instead, Matthew, Reverend Mother Adrian said, stepping forward. The arrest was quiet. The pageant ended not with a handover of a key to a developer, but with a prayer of thanksgiving. Chapter 5. The Fragrance of Lavender and Forgiveness. In the weeks following the arrest of Lord Matthew, Great Slaughter felt as though it was slowly exhaling a breath it had held for half a century. The scaffolding that had begun to rise around the convent was dismantled, leaving the stone walls to bask in the soft autumn sun. Sister Boniface spent her afternoons in the garden, planting lavender near the spot where Sister Helena had been found. It was a gesture of purification, a way to replace the scent of wax and violence with something that spoke of peace. One evening, Sam Gillespie found her there, leaning on her spade. He looked different, less like a man burdened by the law, and more like someone who had found his own footing again. The trial dates are set, Sam said, his voice quiet. Matthew is, well, he's cooperative. I think the guilt was heavier than the debt in the end. Debt can be paid in coin, Inspector Boniface replied, but a life stolen is a debt that only the Lord can settle. How is Ling? Sam managed a small, sad smile. She's resigned. The scandal was too much for her political career, but she's found work at the refuge. She told me the other day that for the first time in years, she doesn't feel like she's hiding from the ghosts of St. Peter's. They stood in silence for a moment, watching the shadows lengthen across the cloisters. And Ruth, Boniface asked, her eyes twinkling with that familiar, sharp mischief. She's staying, Sam admitted, a flush creeping up his neck. At least for a while. She's taken a desk at the local paper. Says Great Slaughter has more stories in its cobblestones than London has in its skyscrapers. I'm glad, Boniface whispered. Every story needs an author, Sam, and every heart needs a home. Chapter 6. A New Covenant. The formal opening of the Sister Helena house was a far cry from the grand, cold unveiling of the Sedgwick Towers. There were no glass-on-steel models, only a simple wooden door painted a welcoming shade of blue. Ronnie Panisa had surprisingly remained involved, though in a much humbler capacity. Under the stern but fair guidance of Reverend Mother Adrian, he had redesigned the project to restore the old manor outbuildings into safe, comfortable apartments for women in need. As the sun began to set on the day of the dedication, the townspeople gathered in the courtyard. There was laughter, the sound of Miss Thimble's choir this time perfectly, in tune and a sense that the quincentennial was truly beginning, not ending. Sister Boniface stood in her lab, looking at a small, framed photograph on her desk. It was Sister Helena, young and vibrant, standing in the ruins of F. We didn't miss it, Helena Boniface whispered to the empty room. The foundations are still strong. Reverend Mother Adrian entered, holding 2 cups of tea. She handed one to Boniface, and stood beside her at the window. The Lord truly does work in mysterious ways, Sister, the mother said, her voice rich with contentment. He took a tragedy and turned it into a testament of our resilience. And he reminded us, Boniface added, that while stone can be carved and land can be sold, the spirit of St. Vincent's is not in the deeds or the plaques. It is in the hands that reach out to the broken. Outside, the first star of the evening appeared over the hills. Great Slaughter was quiet, safe, and for the first time in 500 years, its future felt as certain as its past. Chapter 62. The Smallest Reagent. Eons after the final pageant of the All, the universe existed as a seamless web of light and sound. In this reality, the laws of physics were understood as the Mercy Protocol, and every living being was a note in a cosmic hum. But within the infinite perfection, a young apprentice named Leo felt a flicker of something long forgotten. Leo was a gatherer in the House of Understanding, on a planet called Terracotswold's, a world that looked exactly like the ancient hills of Great Slaughter, but built from refined light. His job was to catalog the resonant frequencies of old souls. One day, while dusting a shelf of forensic memories, Leo noticed something that shouldn't exist in a universe of pure light: a smudge. It was a tiny, dark, greasy stain on a glass tube that once belonged to the legendary catalyst Bonner. This is an impurity, his mentor, a being of pure vibration, hummed. A ghost of the material age. Ignore it, Leah, We have reached the singularity. There is no more mess.